Greetings and welcome to this program on photography. Perhaps more correctly, we should call it 35 millimeter photography, as we'll be dealing with the subject as they relate to the many different cameras and films on the market in the 35 millimeter area. Perhaps I should introduce myself first. My name is David Brady. No relationship at all to the famous Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. It seemed that he and his wife had no children. Well, enough about me. More about what we're going to talk about. We'll, of course, talk about the camera and the camera controls. We'll talk about the film that goes in the cameras, and more than just one kind, indeed. We'll talk about the fact that many cameras you can remove the lens. If you can take the lens off, you would probably want to put another lens on it. And indeed, as we will talk about my philosophy towards putting together my lens system. Talk about filters, close-up photography, vast area there, a little bit on close-up and many other subjects. I can make you a better photographer in just about 4 seconds, however. And that's simply to follow this little rule. Only show your good pictures. It's called editing. Remember, a photographer is known by what he shows, not by what he shoots. If you don't show somebody your bad pictures, they'll never know. And that can make you a better photographer. Another thing that can make you a better photographer is to realize how the camera sees. The camera only has one lens. We have two eyes. So when we're thinking photographically, perhaps we need to close one eye. And indeed, you've seen somebody in the movies sit there and make a frame. Well, they close one eye. It so happens that if you'll extend your arms all the way out and just make a little L out of both hands and touch the thumbs together, close one eye, that's what your camera sees with a normal lens. We'll be using projectors to talk about and share some images. And obviously, there's more than just projectors. There's pictures in those projectors. They're called slides, affectionately called slides. And, well, let's look at a few slides. Because here we have an example of just what I was talking about a couple seconds ago. When you close one eye and extend your arms all the way out, that's what you get with your 50 millimeter lens, your normal lens. As we can see, the angle, the visual acuity that the lens sees, not the eye. Typical snapshot here, perhaps, as we're also guilty of telling the kids to go back there, stand still, shut up, and look at the camera. And then we proceed to make some kind of comment about, oh, look, isn't that smile cute, or some such thing. Look at the very simple cure. We don't have to move the house or the camera. We just simply ask the kids to come up a little closer. I've used as a shooting philosophy for a number of years the little phrase, the name of the game is fill the frame. Fill the frame with whatever is important. But don't make the habit of forgetting the background. Here we've given this young gentleman a couple of horns as we check the background out, and we can see just simply by moving him over a little bit how much stronger the picture is. Foreground, background, both very important. There's also another idea I'd like to pass along, and that's the way we see. It is a fact that our eye seeks brightness. Whenever we walk into a room, our eye always goes to the brightest area. This is not a particularly strong photograph, but it does make the one point. As your eye came on, it immediately went to that area of the screen that's the brightest. It's out of focus. So now we come to the second rule. Our eye seeks brightness. Our eye seeks sharpness. As we have the companion picture, still not a much stronger picture, we've simply shifted the focus, and now our eye is led to the out of focus area into the brighter area, which is sharp and bright at the same time. We can use a little rule called leading lines, as here we have a bright line that enters on the bottom portion of the photograph and takes your eye right into the subject. Leading lines is many times very strong. So here we have a bright boat or two and a leading line that leads your eye to those boats. Our eye seeks brightness. Our eye seeks sharpness. Here we've used the bright sun in the background to silhouette. I know you know what the subject is there. Our eye seeks brightness. Our eye seeks sharpness. Again, same idea. We've used a term here called a natural framing, perhaps, to hold your eye within the photograph. We also have the leaves out of focus, so your eye doesn't spend much time looking at those out of focus leaves. Natural framing, also a leading line. Natural framing here, a leading line. Remember those ideas. So right now, we have come upon three ideas that the way we see, perhaps. Our eye seeks brightness and sharpness. Our eye should deal with the foreground, the background, and edit. Here we have the subject placed in the foreground, the background as it relates to it. Similar picture, same setting. By changing lenses, we now have an entirely different field. And we will discuss later on how we go about deciding which lens and sharpness, terms such as depth of field, other such photographic ideas. There's a very dull picture, isn't it? I hope this is stronger. As we want to give a photograph some depth. And that depth may be simply moving our feet. If we shoot a subject straight on, it has no depth. So here we've moved just to the side, and we now have used light. Photography is capturing light on the film or the light-sensitive area. We're using a means of photography, of course, to communicate right now. The light-sensitive area is not film, but rather an electronic means. This is an example of what I call the bullseye syndrome. It seems that most cameras have some type of a circular device or a device right in the center of the camera. And for some odd reason, although it doesn't say it in the instruction manual, many people feel that that's there as a aid in aiming your subject. It's not that. In fact, it's anything from that. It's there as a focusing aid, perhaps, a metering aid, well, that would be the primarily two reasons that we would find that center area. So don't zero in or fall into the bullseye syndrome. However, we can take advantage of the fact that there is a device there in the center, and we can draw some imaginary lines. Here we've illustrated what is called the rule of thirds. We've divided the format into three equal parts, vertically and horizontally. In this particular example, we have placed the subject, being the mill, smack dab in the center. And let's move the subject, the mill, around to the four principal points and see if the photograph is any stronger. Well, this is certainly a stronger photograph, perhaps. And let's move it around to another principal point. Oh, we got a lot of wasted space up there in the sky, and we've lost most of the waterfall, haven't we? And here we pick up the branch, but still that upper third is totally wasted. And obviously, let's go to the fourth point. probably the stronger of the 5 pictures. We talked about vertical images a second ago, and the fact that I like to take vertical pictures. But realize that maybe we need to put the camera to our eye and try both the vertical or the horizontal. As look how much stronger this image is in the horizontal frame. Well, I said it was stronger, but is it stronger? Because actually, we probably changed the subject. This would now be a photograph of a mill beside the waterfall rather than the other way around. Move the subject around in the viewfinder as you take your photographs. 2 simple circles. One, we've drawn an X smack dab in the middle of it. The other, offset. And as you look at those 2 circles, boy, isn't that one on the far side much more challenging? And that's really what we've been talking about here by using the bullseye not as a centering point, but placing the subject out or and around the edges of the bullseye, sometimes called the golden rule of thirds. Here we have a bullseye picture. Very dull, not using the whole format, not filling the frame. Look how much stronger it is here. Here we've not placed the flag in the center, but over to one side. And here, our subject off to one side. I think you'll find that the subjects will be much stronger if we will use the entire format, place the eyes at or near, oh, those are not eyes, but they sort of look like it, don't they? Place the eyes at or near the upper third line. This will give our subject strength, stature. You want to make somebody, give them a demeaning feeling, put their eyes in the lower quadrant. The eyes are the most important thing when we go to taking people pictures. Portraits, people pictures, whatever you want to call them. So place them at or near the upper third area. Here we know what the subject is. This young man is bright. He's got a white hat on, so he follows the rule then. He's the bright area of the photograph. He's also the only thing in the photograph that's sharp. So our eye seeks brightness, our eye seeks sharpness. Here we have a little bit of a play in the game here. We've got some bright out-of-focus highlights. Your eye probably went back there and said, oh, I'm not supposed to look back there. And then looked about the photograph to try to find out where it was supposed to look. Also, change the camera angle, and this can add some variety to your images. Here we have placed the camera right on the ground, right on the flat surface. The single most common problem of poor picture quality is camera movement. Camera movement, regardless of the camera you have. Whether it's a 35, an Instamatic, big camera, doesn't make any difference. There's one simple cure for that. It's called a picture sharpener. And I have one right back here. A good, heavy tripod. It seems that a lot of people feel that they're not a professional unless they hold the camera. I think you'll find it's the other way around. A professional will use a tripod and will get good, steady, sharp pictures. So camera movement. There's also a couple of ways of avoiding camera movement if you don't have a tripod, and that would be a camera holding technique. I like to use a good strap, put it around my neck, and I bring the camera to my eye in the horizontal fashion. You'll find that my elbows just immediately went in. So I bring the camera to my eye, and I then proceed to focus. Now that would be for, of course, taking a horizontal picture. Realize that there are the possibility, or is the possibility, of shooting a vertical picture. And the way you hold the camera vertically will probably depend upon which eye you use to focus with. If you're right-eyed, you will probably drop the film rewind crank down and place the camera against your forehead. However, if you're left-eyed, I think you'll find that it's kind of sitting out here in the middle of nowhere. So if you're left-eyed, you may find that it's better to operate from this fashion. Now I'm pushing the camera, actually against my thumb, and I can see to focus, and I have made the camera as much a tripod as I can. Maybe I'd be better, well, what do you do with this arm? I personally am right-eyed, and so I find that this method, you'll notice I've made, in effect, a tripod. One hand, the second hand, and my forehead. Glasses, well, that does create a problem. There are the possibility of having a corrective eyepiece made for your lens, your camera lens, or your eyeglass lens, so that it can be placed in the back of the camera. Consult not your camera dealer, but your eye specialist in that regard. So how have we improved our pictures? Well, the first thing we're going to do is edit them. The second thing we're going to do is fill the frame. And third thing, and not the last thing, of course, but we're going to make sure that as we take the photograph, we hold the camera firmly and give it a good foundation. And don't be afraid to use a tripod. The next area I'd like to talk about is acquiring a camera. So you want to buy a camera. Boy, it's a real problem today. I face it, and I'm sure many of you face it. There are so many different cameras on the market, different price ranges, different features. I hope I can shed just a little bit of light on some of that decision-making in the next few minutes. I've placed several cameras that are currently available here in front of me, and I've purposely divided them into two classifications. This group over here we would call rangefinder cameras, and this group known as single lens reflex, or SLRs if you're really in. There are many, many more cameras available in the single lens reflex area than we would find in the rangefinder area. Of course, one of the divisions automatically is dollars. And a good camera, a camera a step above the Pocket Instamatic, let's say, is obviously going to cost more than $100. There's one camera here. Strangely enough, it is really the most automatic camera. It even has autofocus. This one retails for just over $100. A rangefinder camera, it even has a built-in flash gun. It's almost automatic enough that you really have no control over it, and I'm sure most of you are actually interested in getting a camera that maybe does a little bit of the thinking for you, but you have the ability to override. Let's talk for a moment, though, about rangefinder cameras. Rangefinder cameras actually started out, it was the first 35mm camera available. A gentleman by the name of Lights actually built the camera to test film back in the 20s or so. The camera gets its name rangefinder because it uses two small windows to focus with, and the images are superimposed upon one another within the viewfinder. Another camera we have here would be classified as perhaps the second or perhaps third camera, as the case may be, the camera that the serious amateur or professional would have with them at all times. One of the features that these cameras as rangefinders offer is that the shutters are very quiet compared to a single lens reflex. So as we have the camera here set at a 30th of a second, you'll notice not much noise. There's no mirror movement. One of the drawbacks is, however, the fact that seeing exactly what is going to end up on the camera or on the film has made the rangefinder camera perhaps not near as popular as it was a few years ago. And so the fact that you have a little bit of difficulty getting exactly what's on the film, that's where these cameras shine. The single lens reflex camera sees almost 100% on the film exactly what the lens brings into the camera. It does that because there is a mirror in the camera body and a reflex prism that allows the image to travel up and through the camera so that when you put your eye to the viewfinder screen, you see, again, what the lens is projecting. Obviously, the mirror, in most cases, must get out of the way. And that, of course, is where we get into perhaps one of the disadvantages of a single lens reflex, and that is that the shutter may be a bit noisier than the rangefinder camera. Technically, it's more correct to say that the mirror is more noisy. Let's just listen to this one. That was at a 30th of a second, and it wasn't the shutter that was making the noise, but actually the mirror. There are many, many, many different brands, different models available in the single lens reflex area. Many of them are automatic. Put the camera to your eye, and it gives you the exposure. And there's two families of automatic cameras: aperture priority or shutter speed priority. We'll talk about my way of thinking concerning the automatic cameras in the next section. Rangefinder, single lens reflex, they both have their advantages. Cost, perhaps here, a number of choices and versatility would be the big advantage over here. For the next few minutes, I thought we'd talk about film. For the next few minutes, I thought we'd talk about film. Obviously, you have to have film in your camera before you can get any kind of results. Earlier I stated three things go together to give us the final exposure. One is the film's ASA, or its sensitivity. The other is the lens opening and the shutter speed. Let's look at the shutter speed dial for a moment and analyze what's going on here. As we look at these numbers, they're 1,000, right on around to 1. Remember, those are actually fractions of a second. That actually should be 1/1000th of a second, 1/500th, right on around, up to 1 full second. Notice also that they are increments of halving or doubling, depending on which way you go. 4, then 8. Well, that would be 1/4, then 1/8. So as we go from one shutter speed to the next, we will cut the amount of time that the shutter is open in half. Also notice in this particular camera that the ASA setting is located in the shutter speed ring there. That will vary upon the, depending upon the camera that you're using. So shutter speed controls the amount of time that the shutter is open, that the light gets into the camera. But I like to think of it in another way. It also controls the motion rendition. The motion rendition. If I want to photograph a well, let's not talk about the subject. Let's look at a few images that the shutter speed was the determinant factor in deciding as to which combination we wanted to use. Obviously, here, a very high shutter speed used. I believe about a 2,000th of a second. So we stopped water in midair. We don't ordinarily see images such as that. The camera has the ability to grasp just that very split moment of history, so to speak. Here, not the best selection in the world, but I've chose this for a purpose. We all know that race cars usually travel relatively fast around the oval. But here they almost look like they're just parked out there. Although if we look in the background, notice just a slight blur. So the camera photographer did use a shutter speed and did move with the subject. Perhaps a slightly slower shutter speed would have emphasized the speed, however. Here, a high shutter speed used here as the horses have all 4 feet off the ground. So we know that the priority in these cases was for shutter speed. We don't ordinarily see people stand around for a very long period of time with their foot up in the air like that. But this doesn't really do a whole lot for me. Consider an image made at the same outing, purposely using a very slow shutter speed. And I feel that this really gives a feeling of motion and puts a lot of power to that photograph. Here we have purposely attached the camera on the merry-go-round and had it go around with the subject, so we have a blurred background. Here again, the shutter speed was the determinant factor, as well as this image where we put the camera on the tripod, use that picture sharpener we talked about a few minutes ago, and allow the subject to move in. There's no doubt at all. We know that there's some motion going on there. And then potentially we can use a zoom lens and zoom during exposure. That would also perhaps give us a feeling of motion. So I always remember, or try to always remember, that the shutter speed, yes, it is a factor when I go to take a picture, but do I want to use it to be the determinant factor concerning camera movement? Now, of course, that could be whether I move the camera or not. Shutter speed. Lens openings are the other control that we have over exposure. They're those numbers that are, well, they're sometimes called f-stops, aperture. They're the numbers that admittedly are sometimes often a bit confusing. Remember this, however, that they have the same relationship over exposure as the shutter speed in that they halve or double as we move from one full f-stop to another. Let's look at the lens here and look at this f-stop ring. You'll notice some numbers there such as 2, a 2.8, a 4. If I rotate the lens here, we are changing the f-stops. Now actually the lens opening is of course down inside the lens. Here we have the lens set at f22. f22 is actually a smaller lens opening than 16 or a 2 or anything in between. Looks like to me 22 is a bigger number. Why would it be a smaller opening? Well, remember that these are fractions. These are fractions, just the way the shutter speed dial is a fraction. So a 22nd of a piece of pie is much smaller than a half of a piece of pie. Now, I said that it had to do with halving and doubling. Why is it those numbers don't halve and double as we go from one to the other? They are dealing with the area of a circle. Now, f-stops, they control exposure, but they also control another very, very creative tool, and that's called depth of field. Let's look at a couple of images here on the screen that will show us the difference that we get if we choose different f-stops. Here, for example, we're shooting a shot with the lens wide open, and we have minimum depth of field. When we stop the lens down, we end up with a much greater zone of acceptable sharpness. In fact, the smaller the lens opening, the greater the depth of field. Now, we can use that as a creative tool and really control where the person looks. Here, for example, I know you're not looking at the background. The background is totally out of focus. We have a very shallow depth of field, and we can use that creatively. Here, I really don't care if you see that house back there. I'd much rather you look at the tulips. So by opening the lens up, we now throw the house totally out of focus, and now we end up with what I feel is a much more creative use of the lens openings to control depth of field. Remember this: the smaller the lens opening, the greater the zone of acceptable sharpness. The larger the lens opening, then the shallower the zone of acceptable sharpness. Now, most single lens reflexes today focus with the lens wide open. So when we put the camera to our eye, we are focusing at minimum depth of field. And that's really a phenomenal tool because, well, where we focus, we want that to be sharp. Now, we have, on most cameras, really two ways of previewing that zone of acceptable sharpness. And one of them is right on the top of the lens. This lens is set at f/22, and we're focused at about 12 feet. And look, there's an f/22 here and over here. Well, at f/22, the minimum aperture, notice we have a zone of acceptable sharpness from infinity to 6 feet. If I were to use, change the lens to f4, you notice the two little 4s there right on either side of the red arrow? That would tell me that I have just a very small depth of field. So the smaller the lens opening, the greater the depth of field. I have another method that we can use on most cameras, and that's called the depth of field preview button. And on this camera, it's located right here. So as I depress the depth of field preview button, observe the aperture there, opens and closes. Now, this will allow me, with my eye to the camera, to preview that zone of acceptable sharpness. Realize that when the lens is wide open, that's the same as it is most of the time when we focus. Most modern single lens reflex cameras focus with the lens wide open. So if you have your lens set at f1.4 or f2 and you push the depth of field preview button, nothing's really going to change. But if you have the lens stopped down at any particular place, then two things will happen. One, the image will appear to get darker. That is not what we were looking for. What we want to do is observe the relative sharpness of the subjects, both foreground and background, as depth of field extends from the plane of acceptable sharpness, roughly about a 1/3 in front, 2/3 behind the subject. Now, that's a rough rule of thumb. Let's look at some other uses of the depth of field. As we observe, here we have an image where the lens was made wide open. It was made while the lens was wide open. Now we're focused on the branch, and the background is totally out of focus. When we stop the lens down, we increase the zone of acceptable sharpness. Now the branch is still sharp, and now infinity is sharp. So we can have, within limits, anything we really want. Wide-angle lens used here, small image size, so we'll have a great zone of acceptable sharpness. So foreground to background. Wide-angle lenses give us small image sizes, and when we shoot at relatively small apertures, f/16, f/11, we'll have a great zone of acceptable sharpness. Now, when we choose a telephoto lens, we find that we have a very large image size, and that zone of acceptable sharpness is much smaller. That image was made with a 500 millimeter lens. So let's review for a moment. Exposure is a factor of lens opening and shutter speed. Under any given lighting condition, I may have 5 or 6 different possible combinations, or maybe it's infinitely variable. Let's how would I think about the subject? If I'm at the speedway, let's say, I would want to shoot with a high shutter speed, so I'd then set my shutter speed and use the exposure meter, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, to then set my lens opening. But now I have a number of different possible combinations. Instead of taking a picture at a 500th of a second, I could go down to 125th, which is 2 shutter speeds. I would need to then think in terms of, let's see, I've gone to a slower shutter speed, I'm allowing in more light, I now need to stop down the lens, go to a smaller lens opening. If I change 2 shutter speeds here, I would need to stop down, that's the terminology used, my lens opening 2 f-stops. Now that's with a manual camera. And perhaps that's the reason why the automatic cameras have come about, is that people have to think, which way do I need to go? Stop down, open up as I change my shutter speed from one to the other? Well, the automatic camera does that for us automatically. As we said, we've got aperture preferred or shutter preferred. This particular camera, you set the shutter speed, and as you change it, it will automatically open or close the lens and give us this range of f-stops. With this particular camera, it doesn't even have a shutter speed dial on the outside of it. You can see the shutter speeds that you're shooting when you put your camera to your eye, and there's some little LEDs inside there. So this would then be an aperture preferred camera. What's controlling all this thing? Or what's determining what is a good exposure or a bad exposure? Well, that's what's called the light meter. And the light meter is just a phenomenal tool. The light meter in most modern single lens reflex cameras and in many rangefinder cameras, the meter is actually inside the camera. And the light enters the lens and determines the amount of light that's going to fall on the film and ties everything together. And that's what we'll look at in our next section, the light meter. Perhaps the $64,000 question for today could be, what is correct exposure? Let's look at a couple of images of a church. As we observe, there's a considerable difference in the way the sky is rendered. The church almost disappears into the background. And look what happens now when I change the slide, and wow, really got a nice deep blue sky, which is correct. Well, according to the meter, the image that remained constant, the image closer to me, would be the correct exposure. Which do you prefer? Well, are you getting the idea that perhaps you have some say over the exposure? Indeed you do. Let's look at some other situations that maybe cause some concern. How do you meter a sunset? What about snow scenes? What happens if I underexpose by a stop? How do I meter reflections to get that deep color saturation? These are all very valid questions. Here we have an average metered situation, and as we change lenses and move in a little closer, we find that the meter reads the same. What happens when we go inside and shoot out? Now, what's the correct exposure? Well, the correct exposure for the outside is the same, whether you're inside shooting out or outside shooting in. So you see, it is really all relative. Now, the meter in the camera does a fantastic job of getting us to a deciding point. Do you realize that for a little over now, probably about 125 years previous to the last few, they took pictures without a light meter built into the camera? Yes, it has happened for a long time because there are certain standards. And one of the best light meters is right up here, your head and your eye. there is a photographic standard, and that photographic standard is known as a 18% gray card. Now, here we have 3 cards on the side of one of our famous barns. You notice a white card, a gray card, and the black card. The white card is white, the gray card gray, and the black card black. Now, don't be really confused by the color. The meter really, well, we could almost say that it's colorblind. The meter relies on reflectance. It is actually metering the light that is reflected from the subject. And it so happens that that standard is that middle card. Now, we could walk in close and take a meter reading off of the white card and look how we would render the other cards. The meter has only the brain that you bring with it. And here we've taken a meter reading off the black card. Now we've grossly overexposed the white card, and the gray card almost looks white. It just so happens that the world over is really one huge 18% reflectance, and that's green grass, asphalt. That's perhaps why they've set up a photographic standard for the meter as the 18% reflectance. Now, don't forget, the meter doesn't know what film you have in it. So we must check the ASA of the film, and we must set the ASA dial. In this particular camera, you do so by lifting up and moving the little red arrow right across, in this case, 400 ASA. Notice a number of numbers. They also are either halve or double, depending upon which way you go. Might I suggest also that on your birthday, buy your camera a birthday present. That way, at least once a year, you'll have fresh new batteries in your meter. To review, the film we choose will determine the lens opening and shutter combination, and the meter, well, it's that device that draws everything together. Well, it draws everything together, but we really need to know how the meter works. In the next section, we'll talk about some of those specialized metering situations. For example, metering a scene in the snow. The snow is actually set to meter the world covered with green grass. It has a different approach when we cover the earth with snow. Some other situations, such as side lighting, backlighting. The meter can be a phenomenal aid, but we really need to know, and in many cases, think ahead of the meter.